1809, St. Philip's becomes the first Black Episcopal parish in New York City. It attracted the city's leading Black citizens. But even though it had the cream of the crop, so to speak, it still wasn't enough to gain an equal standing with their white Episcopalian brethren. At the 1846 annual convention, leaders of St. Philip's applied for admission, which would give them full standing and equal footing with white Anglican churches. The decision got handed down from the all-white governing body, and it said neither St. Philip's nor any other colored congregation will be admitted into union this convention so as to entitle them to representation therein. Why? Why did the committee make this decision? They said, and I quote, "They are socially degraded and are not regarded as proper associates for the class of person who attend our convention." Now here's the kicker. They also said, "We object not to the color of the skin, but we question their possession of those qualities which would render their intercourse with the members of a church convention useful." In other words, they weren't racist, is what they were trying to say, even though they were excluding St. Philip's purely on the fact that it was a congregation of Black people. The racism is not remarkable. What's remarkable is that Black people didn't abandon the faith altogether. The Black church began developing its own distinctive practices and a theology that spoke to both spiritual, immediate, and physical liberation. Remarkably, Black Christianity grew alongside the explosive expansion of slavery. In fact, it was their faith in God that helped Black believers survive and resist their enslavement. Now, at the outset of the 19th century, when the new nation, these United States, could have become a beacon for diversity and equality, they chose instead to expand the practice of enslavement. It's again this idea of contingency. It didn't have to be this way, but people chose a direction. In the Antebellum era, racism became further embedded in America's foundations and even within American churches. So let's go back to the nation's founding documents. Let's look at the Constitution. In 1787, nation's leaders hold the Constitutional Convention, and they outlined what became the U.S. Constitution, and it stands to this day as the founding document outlining the ideals and function of the United States of America. What's interesting is that the Constitution never used the word slave or slavery, but it's still a pro-slavery document. Historian David Waldeskyer said of the 84 clauses in the Constitution, 6 directly concerned slavery, 5 others had implications for slavery. So here's an example. Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution is known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. And it says, "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, exiting into another, shall be discharged from such service or labor." What that meant in practice was that there was no place that was safe for enslaved Africans. Even if they escaped to freedom, they could be recaptured and sent back to enslavement. And sometimes, even if they were already free Black persons, because they were Black, they could still be captured without cause and sent back and into enslavement. There's also something called the 3/5 clause. That's Article 1, Section 2. It refers to representation in Congress, and what they said in the Constitution is that representation shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, in other words, indentured servants, and excluding Indians who were not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. That all other persons is code for enslaved Africans. And this is known as the 3/5 compromise. There's another compromise called the Dirty Compromise. After ratification of the Constitution, you couldn't discuss abolishing the slave trade for another 20 years, or The states of Georgia and South Carolina threatened not to pass the Constitution at all. So the compromise was, we'll table it for another 2 decades, and that's called the Dirty Compromise. In 1808, Congress finally ceases the transatlantic slave trade to the United States. That means that shipment from West Africa to parts of North America, that was abolished, but it didn't abolish the practice of slavery itself. Those were two separate issues. Now, there were a lot of other compromises that went along with the growth and practice of slavery in this burgeoning United States. One of them is called the Missouri Compromise. That word just keeps coming up again, doesn't it? Compromise. It's always at the expense of enslaved people, too. So in 1820, the government admits Missouri as a slave state, but only on the condition that they admit Maine as a free state to preserve the balance of power, slave and free existing at the same time. And basically, it effectively guaranteed that slavery would remain an American institution for the next several decades. Early legislation protected, or at least did not dismantle, race-based slavery. And so that's the Constitution, that's the political structure of the United States. But what about the church? Well, similar compromises are happening with white supremacy and slavery at crucial points early on in U.S. history. One of the things you got to understand about slavery is the chattel principle. So chattel means property. James W.C. Pennington, he was a minister and an abolitionist, a black man, said this: "The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, and the cart whip, the starvation, and nakedness are its inevitable consequences." One book that really brings home this idea of the chattel principle is by Walter Johnson, and it's called Soul by Soul. In that book, Dr. Johnson says the entire economy of the antebellum South was constructed on the idea that the bodies of enslaved people had a measurable monetary value. Enslaved Africans were valued for their physical strength, for their reputation for obedience. They were property, so they were used as collateral for loans and even handed down from parents to children as an inheritance. Now, because they were treated as property, any ties of family could be severed at absolutely any moment. There were more than 600,000 interstate sales of enslaved Africans. Historians estimate that 25% of those sales destroyed a first marriage, and that 50% broke up a nuclear family, and also that children, even under the age of 13, were sold away from their parents. Under the chattel principle, men and women were treated differently. You see, men were valued for their productive labor, what they could do in the fields or the factory or whatever it might be. Black women were valued not only for their productive ability, but for their reproductive ability as well. And it was harsh. So black women were expected to work in the fields all throughout their pregnancy, right up to the moment of giving birth. And then they didn't have much time to convalesce. They didn't have much time to take care of their baby. There was no such thing as maternity leave. They were expected to quickly go back to work. Not only that, they were expected to raise their own children, labor alongside the men, and also oftentimes to raise children of their enslavers as well. So black women had the double duty of doing all the work of an enslaved person, but also being expected to reproduce and thereby grow the workforce for the plantation owner. Unfortunately, another aspect of life as a black enslaved woman was rape. And it was almost inevitable for many black women. White mistresses, other women who you could perhaps expect some gender solidarity from, they proved of no help as well. They were complicit in this. Enslavers had almost absolute legal authority over their property, so black women and their families and the people who cared about them had absolutely no recourse. We know their stories of enslaved women through narratives like the one that Harriet Jacobs wrote called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She writes about how she tried to avoid the lascivious advances of Dr. Flint, her owner, and the choice she had to make between succumbing to Dr. Flint or, on another hand, there was a free white man who was interested in her, and perhaps she should go with him because if they had children together, perhaps this free white man would allow his children to be free. Ultimately, Harriet Jacobs decides not to be raped, but to willingly give herself to this white man, this free white man, mainly for the sake of her children. But Harriet Jacobs is a faithful Christian woman. She only wants to be married to someone who loves her and to raise her children the way she thinks that Scripture teaches, the way her grandmother, who's a Christian, teaches. And so as she's writing this narrative of her life, she directly addresses women who are reading it. And she says, "But O ye happy women, whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, whose homes are protected by law, do not judge the poor desolate slave girl too severely." You see, these are the kind of impossible choices that Black women faced under slavery. American Christians largely chose to turn a blind eye to things like family separation and the scarring of bodies and starvation of stomachs, rape, and generational trauma that happened with enslavement. The Bible speaks of love of neighbor, and however individual Christians may have personally felt about the practice of slavery, not enough people did enough to fight it. Instead, they were complicit with the continuation of slavery. But even as so many white Christians were complicit with the status quo of slavery, there was resistance and rebellion. Enslaved Black people were victimized, but they were not victims. See, so far we focused a lot on white racism and complicity with racism, but we also have to recognize the strength and resilience of Black people in the face of crushing attempts at dehumanization. Black people did not passively accept their enslavement. They resisted it by any means available to them. So this resistance took multiple forms. For instance, they deliberately broke tools to delay the work. They would set fires at various spots on the plantation. Others would pretend to be sick and so get out of work. Some even feigned mental slowness to make them seem less capable. Other enslaved people, they stole food or other items as compensation for all this unpaid labor that they were doing. Even learning to read was a form of resistance. Now, there are other forms that are a bit more obvious. For instance, escape. But escape was extremely risky. If you failed, you could get a beating at best, or mutilation, or even death at the worst. And it's gendered here too, because men were more able to escape because women were expected to care for children. It's a lot harder to run for freedom when you've got children in tow than when you're solo. But enslaved people would make up songs and they would encode messages of liberation into these songs. Songs like "Steal Away to Jesus" were often sung when it was time to escape, or "Follow the Drinking Gourd." Embedded in this song were directions that enslaved people could follow to freedom. Now, escape was one form of resistance. Another, and probably the most obvious and rare form, was outright rebellion. It's the most ambitious, it's the most risky form of resistance. But enslaved people in North America actually got inspiration from people in Haiti. Enslaved Africans in Haiti waged the first successful slave revolution of the modern Atlantic world from 1781 to 1804, and they resisted the rule of white Europeans. And as the news spread, it inspired enslaved Africans all over the world. And it caused fear among plantation owners and white people who always suspected a slave revolt might be brewing. Sometimes they were right. Denmark Vesey was a Black man. He was born into slavery, and he literally won the lottery and bought his freedom for $600. But something that always vexed him was the fact that he couldn't purchase his wife and children. And so he never gave up the pursuit of freedom, not only for himself, but for them as well. In the year 1817, he joined Emmanuel AME in Charleston and became a leader in the church. A few years later, in 1822, partially inspired by the Haitian Revolution, he planned a massive slave revolt. Now, before they could actually start the revolt, another enslaved person gave away the plans to white people, and then Vesey, along with more than 30 other suspects, were executed. And as punishment, they also burned Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church to the ground. Several years later, in 1828, a man named Nat Turner, also an enslaved black person, wrote about his inspiration to rebel. He said that God would make known to him by signs in the heavens that he should commence the great work, and that I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons. And he did just that. On August 21st, 1831, the moon eclipsed the sun, and Nat Turner took it as a divine sign. It was time to rebel. So Turner and 6 followers entered the house of a slaveholder and murdered the entire family in their sleep. He and his band moved on to other homes and did the same thing. His followers grew, and by the end, around 55 white men, women, and children had died by their hands. They were captured on October 30th and executed on November 11th. But it didn't end there. You see, in response, the white community killed more than 100 black people, sometimes just indiscriminately. And they also created harsher laws about mobility and assembly. You see, white Christians and others didn't want black people getting together, because when black folks got together, they plotted escape. They talked about freedom. They talked about liberty. And so Christians, white Christians, eventually basically came to practice a paternalistic and pro-slavery form of Christianity. White enslavers wanted to control black bodies and black expressions of Christianity. And so this paternalistic Christianity monitored and chose what was acceptable in black worship and congregations. Historian Charles F. Irons wrote The Origins of Pro-Slavery Christianity. And he indicates that prior to the Civil War, many blacks and whites, they worshiped together in the same congregation. Of course, it was a means of controlling the belief of black people and to prevent the insurrection of black people. And so this is paternalism. It comes from the idea that a slave plantation is basically an extended household. That household is headed by a man who is this benevolent patriarch. That's the slave master. And it views in this plantation household enslaved black people as children. And they're part of the patriarch's household, but they're perpetual children. They needed protection and discipline and guidance, and they could never actually grow into full independence as a parent would actually hope their child would if they truly loved them. Now, you can see paternalism at work in some of the institutions that Christians created. One was called the American Colonization Society. And basically, their whole goal was to relocate black people back to Africa. Now, some people wanted to go back. This sounds good, right? Let's escape from the enslavement and the racism and the white supremacy of the United States. Let's go back to our homeland in Africa and start a society there. Sounds good, right? Well, there's some paternalism embedded even in that notion. It's based on an assumption articulated by a guy named Robert Finley. And he said at the time, we should be cleared of them, meaning black people, and that black people would never be ready for the demands of democracy. Furthermore, the African Colonization Society basically thought that people who remained in Africa, that they had to be civilized through contact with other African people who were now civilized because of their interactions with Europeans. So you see the paternalism going on there. Yeah, go back to Africa because 1, we get rid of you in the United States. 2, you could never really have your full freedom here anyway. And 3, you can go civilize those other people on the continent of Africa because you've been around Europeans now. That was some of the paternalism that Christians practiced toward people of African descent. Now, we've talked about a great revival, but there was a second great revival, or the second great awakening. These are massive conversions. For instance, the Cane Ridge revival, which occurred in Kentucky in 1801, 20 to 30,000 people attended, historians estimate, and it was also called America's Pentecost. It's just this dramatic outpouring of faith and conversion. There's the growth in this time of the idea of post-millennialism. And it became popular, and what it basically meant was that Jesus would return, but only after Christians ushered in this era of peace and justice. And so what that did was inspire Christians to these justice movements, and including abolition. But there were other cares like orphan care, prohibition, care for widows and the poor. And yet, even in the midst of this, even as Christians labored for peace and justice in these areas, they still compromised with racism. So Cane Ridge Revival, America's Pentecost, it was still segregated by race, which is ironic because in the biblical Pentecost in Acts 2, people are speaking in different languages, and folks from all languages and tribes are being gathered together, and yet at America's Pentecost, they're still being split apart by race. A famous revivalist preacher, to give another example, is Charles Finney. He was president of Oberlin College. Now, Oberlin is unique because it was the first to accept women and the first to accept black people. And Charles Finney was an abolitionist. So you would think this is an ally. This is somebody who's helping black people. To a point. You see, Charles Finney, he wasn't a fan of so-called social integration of the races. So he advocated abolition. He wanted black people to go to school at his college, but and he even excluded white slave owners from membership in his congregation. But within that same congregation, he segregated black worshipers in the pews. Members who were black could not hold office. So social reform, he thought, would happen through individual conversion, not institutional or social reform. And that mindset, this fixation on individual conversion to the exclusion of changing policies and practices related to race continues to be one of the stark dividing lines along race and ideology within the church. Within the antebellum period, what we're seeing is that compromise continues. In this time, the black church grew, and it served as a source of strength and resistance for black people. Rebellion and resistance also grew among black people as they tried to escape from slavery or plot rebellions to gain their own freedom. And yet, at the same time, slavery becomes further embedded in American culture. And evangelical Christianity, it's becoming more mainstream, but it continues to have this strained, tense relationship with race and justice. Churches compromised their prophetic voice in the culture by acquiescing to the system of slavery and white supremacy. Competing understandings of freedom, equality, and belonging in both the country and the congregation would one day soon explode into the Civil War.